My name is Cale Thornwick, and I work the deep manufactorums of Hive Tertius on Mordian 7th. When I tell you about love in this place, understand that I speak of something fragile and desperate, something that blooms in the spaces between patrol routes and withers under the weight of endless surveillance. This is not a story of grand romance or noble sacrifice. This is about two people trying to find warmth in a world that has forgotten what warmth means. The air tastes of recycled breath and metal shavings down here in sub-level Theta 9. 37 floors beneath the spire's gleaming facade, where the nobles play their games of politics and pleasure, we forge the bolts that hold their world together. The manufactorum floor stretches for kilometers in every direction, a maze of conveyor belts, stamping presses, and assembly stations that never sleep. The sound is constant, a rhythmic pounding that becomes the heartbeat of your existence. After 18 years of this work, I no longer hear it as noise. It is simply the sound of being alive. I first saw Mira Castellan 3 months ago during the mid-shift rotation. She moved between the quality control stations with a grace that seemed impossible in this place of grinding machinery and harsh illumination. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, revealing the pale line of her neck above her work coveralls. When she looked up from her data slate, her eyes held something I had not seen in years. Not hope exactly, but a kind of quiet defiance against the crushing weight of our existence. The Imperium teaches us that love is a luxury we cannot afford. Personal attachments weaken devotion to the Emperor. They create dependencies that compromise efficiency. They breed the kind of individualistic thinking that leads to heresy. These lessons are carved into us from the moment we can walk, reinforced through daily prayer, work quotas, and the ever-present threat of re-education. Yet somehow, in defiance of all logic and safety, I found myself thinking about her during the long hours of assembly line work. Our shift begins at 400 hours, when the klaxons sound their harsh awakening call throughout the hab blocks. By 430, we are at our stations, heads bowed for the daily recitation of the litany of work. In toil we find purpose. We chant in unison, our voices echoing off the metal ceiling. In purpose we find the Emperor's will. In the Emperor's will we find our salvation. The words taste like ash in my mouth, but they are necessary. The servo skulls that drift above us record everything, their mechanical eyes scanning for signs of insufficient devotion. Mira works Station Gamma 7, checking bolt tolerances and recording variance reports. Her supervisor is a grizzled woman named Overseer Valdris, who earned her position through 40 years of flawless service and an absolute dedication to Imperial doctrine. Valdris watches her workers with the intensity of a hunting hawk, noting every pause, every glance, every moment of potential inefficiency. Under her gaze, conversation is minimal and always focused on work. But there are moments, brief spaces between the supervisory rounds when words can be exchanged. During one such moment, as I delivered a crate of finished bolt heads to her station, Mira looked up from her cogitator screen and spoke. "The tolerance variances have been increasing," she said, her voice barely audible over the machinery. "Batch 77 Alpha shows microfractures in the threading." I nodded, understanding immediately. This was not about bolt tolerances. This was about us. About the careful distance we maintained, the professional facade that barely concealed something deeper. The microfractures she spoke of were in ourselves, the tiny breaks in our conditioning that allowed forbidden thoughts to take root. "I'll check the stamping pressure settings," I replied, meeting her eyes for just a moment. After shift ends. Those words carried weight beyond their surface, meaning after shift meant the brief window of semi-freedom before mandatory rest cycle. It meant navigating the curfew patrols and surveillance networks that monitored every movement through the hab blocks. It meant finding ways to exist as something more than productive units in the Emperor's grand machine. The curfew begins at 2,200 hours and lasts until 400. During these 6 hours, movement through the hive is restricted to essential personnel only. Workers returning from late shifts, maintenance crews, and the ever-present Adeptus Arbites patrols. The streets between the manufacturums and residential blocks become canyon-like spaces filled with shadows and the distant hum of atmospheric processors. Lumen strips provide pools of sickly yellow light every 50 meters, creating a checkerboard of visibility and darkness. To meet someone during curfew hours requires careful planning. The patrol routes follow predictable patterns, timed to ensure complete coverage while maintaining efficiency. The Arbites move in pairs, their carapace armor gleaming under the artificial lighting, shock mauls hanging ready at their belts. They are not cruel, these enforcers, merely thorough. They understand that order requires constant vigilance, that even the smallest deviation from protocol can lead to chaos. But patterns can be learned, timing can be memorized, and love, it seems, makes people willing to take extraordinary risks. The drinking establishment I chose was called the Rust Crown, located in a converted storage bay 3 levels down from my hab unit. It was not officially a bar, as recreational alcohol consumption required permits that were rarely granted to manufacturing personnel. Instead, it existed in the gray space of imperial bureaucracy, technically classified as a nutritional supplement dispensary that happened to serve fermented grain beverages alongside the mandatory protein rations. The proprietor was an ancient man called Jorik, who had lost his left arm in a plasma conduit explosion 20 years earlier. The mechanical replacement that clicked and whirred when he moved was a masterwork of mechanicus engineering, all brass fittings and exposed servo motors. He had served as a tech adept before his injury forced him into civilian life, and he understood the careful balance between following regulations and allowing people the small comforts that made existence bearable. "The usual Thornwick?" he asked when I arrived at 2,147 hours, 13 minutes before curfew began. His mechanical fingers clinked against the metal surface of the bar as he reached for a bottle of something that might generously be called ale. "2," I said quietly. "I'm expecting someone." Jorik's human eye studied me for a long moment. The mechanical one, a red lens set into his scarred socket, whirred softly as it focused. Expecting someone during curfew hours was dangerous. It implied planning, coordination, the kind of personal relationships that drew unwanted attention. "The temperature control has been irregular lately," Jorik said finally, filling 2 ceramic cups with the pale liquid. "People have been coming in to warm up, nothing unusual about that." I nodded, understanding. If questioned, we were simply 2 workers seeking shelter from the artificially regulated atmosphere. Random encounters, not planned meetings. The distinction was subtle but legally significant. Mira arrived 17 minutes after curfew began. I heard her footsteps on the metal grating outside before the door cycled open, admitting a swirl of recycled air and the distant sound of machinery. She moved quickly, her regulation work boots making soft clicking sounds against the floor. Her eyes swept the dimly lit space before settling on me, and something in her expression relaxed. "The heating in Hab Block 7 is malfunctioning again," she said, loud enough for Jorik to hear. Then quieter, "I thought I might not make it. There's an extra patrol on level 15 tonight." I pushed the second cup toward her, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she lifted it. The fermented grain brew was bitter and thin, but it was warm, and warmth was a precious commodity in the deep levels of the hive. "Equipment failures seem to be increasing," I replied, maintaining the fiction. "Perhaps the Mechanicus needs to perform more thorough maintenance rituals." We spoke like this for nearly an hour, our conversation layered with double meanings and careful omissions. To any listening devices, we were simply 2 workers discussing operational concerns and seeking temporary shelter. But beneath the surface, we were mapping the territories of each other's thoughts, finding the places where our carefully constructed facades showed cracks. Mira had been born in the mid-levels, the daughter of a scribe who served the local administratum office. Her childhood had been spent among data slates and filing systems, learning to navigate the endless bureaucracy that kept the hive functioning. but a clerical error in her educational placement had sent her to the manufacturing levels instead of continuing in administrative service. She spoke of it without bitterness, but I could hear the loss in her voice. The life she might have lived, surrounded by books and knowledge instead of metal and noise. I sometimes wonder what it would be like, she said, staring into her cup, to work with living things instead of machines, growing food maybe, or tending animals, places where things change and grow instead of just wearing down. Such thoughts bordered on dangerous territory. The Imperium's vast cities were built on the principle that humanity's role was to serve the machine of empire, not to engage in primitive agricultural pursuits. But in the dim lighting of the rust crown, with the sound of distant machinery muffling our words, such forbidden dreams felt safe to share. My grandfather told me stories, I said, about the first settlers on Mordian the 7th, before the hive cities, when there were still open skies and natural weather patterns. He said the air smelled different then, clean. Mira looked up from her drink, her eyes meeting mine across the small table. Do you believe those stories? I want to, I admitted. I want to believe that somewhere, somehow, things were different once. This was perhaps the most heretical thing I had ever said. The imperial truth taught that humanity's current state was the natural and optimal order of existence. To suggest that things had been better in the past, or that they could be different in the future, was to question the fundamental wisdom of the Emperor's design. Yet saying it to her felt like the most honest thing I had ever done. We left separately, spaced 10 minutes apart to avoid creating patterns that surveillance systems might detect. Mira went first, disappearing into the maze of corridors that led back toward the residential blocks. I waited, counting my heartbeats, before following a different route that would take me through 3 separate security checkpoints on the way to my hab unit. The patrols were routine that night. At checkpoint Delta 7, an Arbeits enforcer scanned my work identification and recorded my biometric data. His partner, a woman with the scarred hands of a veteran, asked standard questions about my destination and purpose for being outside during curfew hours. Nutritional supplement dispensary, I replied, showing the receipt Jorik had provided. Regulation compliance for metabolic requirements. The enforcer studied the receipt with professional thoroughness. The rust crown was registered with the appropriate authorities, its inventory properly catalogued and taxed. Workers were permitted to seek additional nutrition if their shift schedules created metabolic imbalances. Everything was in order, documented, accounted for. Proceed to your designated residential area, the enforcer said, returning my identification. Report any unusual activity to the nearest patrol unit. For the Emperor, I replied, giving the proper response. For the Emperor, she echoed, already turning her attention to the next checkpoint. My hab unit was a standard arrangement, 3 meters by 4 meters, with a sleeping alcove, basic sanitation facility, and small preparation area for food rations. The walls were painted in regulation gray, marked only by a standard Imperial aquila and a data screen that provided shift schedules and administrative announcements. It was identical to thousands of other units throughout the residential blocks, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. But that night, as I lay in the narrow sleeping alcove, the space felt different, changed. The memory of conversation, of shared thoughts and careful glances, had transformed it from merely a place of rest into something approaching a home. For the first time in years, I found myself imagining how it might look with small personal touches, a second cup on the preparation counter, clothing that did not belong to me hanging in the storage alcove, the quiet breathing of another person in the darkness. Such thoughts were dangerous, but I could not stop them. They colored my dreams with possibilities that the imperial doctrine would have labeled as heretical self-indulgence. I dreamed of conversations that lasted longer than stolen moments, of walks through corridors where we did not have to pretend to be strangers, of a life where love was not measured against productivity, quotas, and surveillance reports. The next morning's shift began like any other, The klaxons sounded at 400. The litany of work echoed through the manufactorum at 430. The assembly lines resumed their endless rhythm of production, but everything had changed, because now I had something to look forward to beyond the completion of each day's quota. Mira was at her station when I arrived with the morning's delivery of raw materials. She looked up from her data slate as I set down the crate, her expression professionally neutral. But there was something in her eyes, a warmth that had not been there before, that made the harsh lighting seem less oppressive. "Quality control reports from the night shift," she said, handing me a data wafer. "Standard tolerances maintained." "I'll pass this along to the production supervisors," I replied, taking the wafer. Our fingers touched briefly as I accepted it, a contact that lasted perhaps half a second, but sent warmth spreading through my chest. That small touch sustained me through 8 hours of assembly line work, through the mechanical repetition of bolt installation and torque verification, through the midday meal of corpse starch and reclaimed water, through the afternoon productivity lecture and the evening shift change procedures. It was a tiny rebellion against the dehumanizing efficiency of our existence, a reminder that we were more than the sum of our labor output. But small rebellions, like seeds in hostile soil, require careful tending to survive. The second meeting was more difficult to arrange. The patrol schedules had been modified, adding random elements that made timing unpredictable. Extra security sweeps were being conducted in the industrial sectors, ostensibly as part of routine efficiency audits but clearly designed to discourage unauthorized gatherings. The Rust Crown remained open, but Jorik had mentioned increased scrutiny from regulatory inspectors. We communicated through the work assignment system, embedding coded messages in routine production reports. Mira would file variance notifications that included timestamp data. I would respond with delivery confirmations that contained location coordinates. To any reviewing administrator, these were simply the mundane communications required for manufacturing operations. But encoded within the numbers and technical specifications were the desperate plans of two people trying to find each other in a maze of restrictions and surveillance. "Bolt delivery to Gamma 7 requires special handling procedures," read one of my reports. "Recommend quality assessment at 2,200 hours, Storage Bay 15. Storage Bay 15 was 2 levels below the Rust Crown, in a section of the hive used for long-term inventory storage. The lighting was minimal, activated only by motion sensors that created pools of illumination as workers passed through. During curfew hours, it would be empty except for the automated systems that monitored environmental conditions and inventory levels. I arrived first, moving carefully through corridors I had mapped during previous shifts. The bay was vast and filled with towering shelves of manufactured goods waiting for transport to other sectors of the hive. Somewhere in the darkness above, servo skulls drifted on silent patrol routes, their mechanical eyes recording everything for later review. But the shelving created blind spots, spaces where two people could stand close enough to speak without being observed. Mira appeared 15 minutes later, moving like a ghost through the shadows between the inventory racks. She wore a maintenance technician's coveralls over her regular clothing, the kind that would justify her presence in restricted areas during curfew hours. Her hair was hidden beneath a regulation work hood, but I would have recognized her silhouette anywhere. "This is more dangerous," she said without preamble, settling into the narrow space between two shelving units. "The new patrol patterns are more thorough." "I know," I replied, "but I needed to see you again." The admission hung in the air between us like an accusation. Need was not a word the Imperial doctrine encouraged. Need implied dependency, weakness, the kind of personal attachment that compromised loyalty to the Emperor. Good citizens wanted only to serve. They needed nothing beyond the opportunity to contribute their labor to the great machine of empire. But I did need her, in ways that went beyond logic or safety or ideological purity. I needed the sound of her voice, the way she looked at the world with eyes that refused to accept that grinding efficiency was the only way to exist. I needed the proof she represented that somewhere beneath the layers of conditioning and control, humanity still survived. "I've been thinking about what you said," Mira continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "about your grandfather's stories, about how things used to be." "Those were just stories," I said automatically. "Imperial doctrine teaches us that the current order is optimal for humanity's survival. But what if it's not?" The words came out in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for days. "What if we're not surviving at all, but just dying slowly? What if this isn't life, but just another kind of death?" Such questions were not merely heretical, they were dangerous to even think. The Imperium's vast surveillance networks monitored not just actions but thoughts, attitudes, the subtle patterns of behavior that indicated ideological contamination. Citizens who asked too many questions about the nature of their existence had a tendency to disappear into re-education facilities or penal colonies. But in the darkness of Storage Bay 15, surrounded by the products of our labor and the mechanical hum of automated systems, her questions felt like the most important words ever spoken. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know if things could be different, but I know that when I'm with you, everything feels more real, more alive, like there's something worth preserving in all of this." She moved closer, and I could feel the warmth of her body in the cool air of the storage bay. "Is that enough? Just feeling alive for stolen moments between shifts?" "It has to be," I said. "It's all we have." We stood there in the shadow of the inventory shelves, two small figures dwarfed by the immensity of the hive around us. Above, the servo skulls continued their endless patrol. Beyond the bay walls, millions of people slept in identical hab units, preparing for another day of identical labor. The great machine of the Imperium ground forward, transforming human lives into resources, dreams into productivity, statistics, love into efficiency metrics. But for a few precious minutes, we were more than components in that machine. We were Kale and Mira, two people who had found each other across the vast loneliness of existence and chosen to risk everything for the simple act of being human together. When we parted that night, she kissed my cheek, a brief touch of lips against skin that lasted perhaps 2 seconds but changed everything. It was such a small gesture, barely worth noting in the context of the vast cruelties and endless struggles that defined life in the hive. But it was also an act of profound rebellion, a declaration that despite everything the Imperium had done to strip away our humanity, something essential remained. The third meeting never happened. I arrived at the designated location, another storage facility in the industrial sector, at the agreed time, but Mira did not come. I waited for an hour past the scheduled rendezvous, hidden among the shipping containers and automated loading equipment, before accepting that something had gone wrong. The next morning's shift brought the explanation. Overseer Valdris made an announcement to the workers at Station Gamma 7 during the morning productivity briefing. Mira Castellan had been selected for enhanced screening as part of routine loyalty assessments. She would be temporarily reassigned to different duties while the evaluation was conducted. Enhanced screening. The word sent ice through my veins. Enhanced screening was the bureaucratic euphemism for the process that evaluated citizens whose loyalty scores had dropped below acceptable thresholds. It involved intensive interviews, psychological testing, review of personal associations, and analysis of behavior patterns. Citizens who passed the screening returned to their duties with improved loyalty ratings and enhanced surveillance protocols. Citizens who failed simply disappeared. I maintained my composure through the work shift, performing my duties with mechanical precision while my mind raced through possibilities. Had our meetings been detected? Were the coded messages in the production reports discovered? Had someone reported suspicious behavior? Or was this simply random selection, the kind of bureaucratic lottery that occasionally claimed innocent citizens as part of the Imperium's endless hunger for control? The questions tormented me through 8 hours of assembly line work. During the midday break, I found myself staring at Station Gamma 7, now occupied by a replacement worker who processed quality control data with the same methodical efficiency but none of Mira's grace. The space felt hollow, emptied of something essential. That evening, instead of returning to my hab unit, I made my way to the Rust Crown. Jorik was behind the bar as usual, his mechanical arm clicking softly as he cleaned drinking vessels with practiced movements. He looked up when I entered, his human eye studying my face with the careful attention of someone who had survived decades in the gray spaces of Imperial society. "Rough shift?" he asked, setting a cup of fermented grain brew on the bar without being asked. "Enhanced screening," I said quietly. Someone I knew. Yorik's mechanical eye whirred as it focused on my face. Knew how well? The question was loaded with implications. Personal relationships were monitored and evaluated as part of loyalty assessments. Citizens who formed inappropriate attachments were considered security risks. If the screening process had identified my connection to Mira, I could be next for evaluation. "Work-related interactions only," I replied, giving the safe answer. "Quality control coordination." "Of course." Yorik nodded, understanding the necessary fiction. "Work relationships are important for maintaining productivity. Nothing wrong with being concerned about a colleague's welfare." We maintained the careful pretense while I drank, speaking only of work quotas and equipment maintenance issues. But when I prepared to leave, Jorik leaned across the bar and spoke quietly. "Enhanced screening takes 3 weeks," he said. "Standard protocol. After that, workers either return to normal duties or receive new assignments. No point in worrying about things beyond your control." 3 weeks. 21 days of uncertainty, of wondering whether the woman I loved was being systematically broken down by Imperial interrogators or simply processed through routine bureaucratic procedures. 21 days of maintaining normal behavior patterns while fighting the urge to seek information, to ask questions, to do anything that might connect me to her case. The first week was the hardest. Every morning, I expected to be summoned for my own screening. Every patrol encounter during curfew hours seemed to last longer, the questions more probing. Every servo skull that drifted past my workstation felt like an accusation. I performed my duties with obsessive precision, maintained perfect compliance with all regulations, and spoke to no one beyond the minimum requirements of workplace communication. But the summons never came. Either our meetings had not been detected, or I was not considered significant enough to warrant investigation. In the vast machinery of Imperial surveillance, I was just another manufacturing worker, statistically unlikely to pose any meaningful threat to order and stability. The second week brought a different kind of torment. I began to realize how much of my existence had been reorganized around the possibility of seeing her. The careful timing of my deliveries to Station Gamma 7, the routes through the manufactorum that took me past her workspace, the anticipation that had made even the most routine tasks bearable because they might lead to stolen moments of connection. Without that possibility, work became purely mechanical again. The assembly lines resumed their status as instruments of grinding repetition. The harsh lighting returned to being simply harsh. The taste of corpse starch rations, briefly made tolerable by the memory of shared conversations, became bitter again. During the third week, I began to understand what Mira had meant when she asked if we were surviving or just dying slowly. The careful elimination of hope, of connection, of anything that made existence more than mere function, was indeed a kind of death. A systematic stripping away of humanity until only productive capacity remained. But then, on the morning of the 22nd day, she was back. I arrived at Station Gamma 7 with the morning's delivery of materials and found Mira at her usual workspace, head bent over her data slate as if she had never been away. She looked up when I approached, and for a moment our eyes met across the space between us. She was changed. The warmth that had begun to bloom in her expression during our brief courtship was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality that marked citizens who had survived enhanced screening. Her movements were more precise, more mechanical. Her responses to workplace communications were exactly what regulations required, nothing more or less. "Quality control station ready to receive materials," she said, her voice flat and professional. "Materials delivered according to schedule," I replied, setting down the crate with mechanical precision. That was all. No hidden meanings in the words, no careful touches during the exchange of data wafers, no glances that suggested anything beyond strict compliance with workplace protocols. She had been returned to us, but the woman who had asked dangerous questions about the nature of existence was gone. I understand now what enhanced screening actually does. It does not simply evaluate loyalty and return citizens to their duties. It surgically removes the parts of personality that might lead to troublesome thoughts or behaviors. The process leaves the productive capacity intact while eliminating the human elements that make productivity meaningful. Mira continued to work at Station Gamma 7 for another month before receiving her new assignment. The transfer orders came through routine administrative channels, reassigning her to a manufacturing facility in Hive Secundus on the other side of the continent. Standard personnel rotation, designed to prevent the formation of the kind of local attachments that might compromise loyalty to the broader Imperial structure. On her last day, I delivered materials to her station one final time. She processed the delivery with the same mechanical efficiency she had shown since her return from screening, but as I prepared to leave, she spoke. "Kyle Thornwick," she said, using my full name for the first time since the screening. "I want you to know that I remember everything." The words were spoken quietly, barely audible over the background noise of the manufactorum. To anyone monitoring our conversation, they would seem like a simple acknowledgement of our professional relationship. But I heard the deeper meaning, the message she was risking everything to convey. The screening process had not erased her memories, only her ability to act on the feelings they represented. Somewhere beneath the carefully constructed loyalty protocols, the woman who had dreamed of growing things and questioned the nature of our existence still survived. She could not express those feelings, could not allow them to influence her behavior, but she had not forgotten. "I remember too," I said, giving the only response I could. That evening, after she had cleared out her personal effects and submitted her final reports, Mira Castellan disappeared into the transport network that would carry her to her new assignment. I watched through the observation windows as the cargo lifter rose through the hive levels, carrying her away from everything we had briefly shared. The next morning, her replacement arrived at Station Gamma 7. A young man named Darius, fresh from the educational facilities, eager to prove his worth through devotion to duty and compliance with regulations. He processed quality control data with admirable efficiency and maintained perfect workplace communication protocols. But the space remained empty, hollowed out by the absence of something that had never officially existed. That was 6 months ago. I continue to work the deep levels of the manufactorum, delivering materials and maintaining production schedules with mechanical precision. The assembly lines turn out their quotas of bolts and fasteners, contributing to the vast construction projects that keep the Imperium functioning. The servo skulls drift overhead, recording everything for later analysis. The patrol routes continue their predictable patterns through the corridors and hab blocks. During curfew hours, I sometimes find myself walking past Storage Bay 15, where we once stood together in the shadow of inventory shelves and spoke dangerous words about the nature of existence. The space is unchanged, filled with the same products waiting for transport to other sectors of the hive. But it feels different now, haunted by the memory of two people who briefly found each other in the vast loneliness of the Imperial machine. I no longer visit the Rust Crown. The risk-to-benefit calculation no longer makes sense without someone to share the carefully maintained fiction of seeking shelter from atmospheric irregularities. Jorik nods when I pass his establishment during shift changes, a slight acknowledgement between survivors who understand the price of small comforts in a system designed to eliminate them. But I have not stopped thinking about the questions Mira asked in those precious stolen moments, about the difference between survival and slow death, about what humanity means in a context designed to strip it away, about whether the tiny rebellions of connection and care are worth the enormous risks they entail. The answers, I think, depend on what you believe survival actually means. If survival is simply the continuation of biological function within acceptable productivity parameters, then the imperial system succeeds brilliantly. The hive cities house billions of human beings who eat their rations, perform their duties, and contribute their labor to the great machine of empire. They survive, in the most basic sense of the word. But if survival means something more than mere function, if it requires